What would you do if you woke up one morning to find that everything you'd worked for, your home, your legacy, your very way of life, had been destroyed under the guise of community improvement? If a group of self-important bureaucrats decided that your dreams didn't fit their vision and wiped them out without so much as a conversation? That's exactly what happened to me, and it all started with a single letter. The morning I found the first HOA notice stuffed in my mailbox, the sun was warm on my back as I collected eggs from my hens. Their soft clucking had always been a comforting sound, a reminder that I had built something real, something that mattered. My 6 acres of farmland sat just outside Pine Creek, a quiet haven of fresh air, sun-ripened tomatoes, and the scent of damp earth. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, left to me by my grandfather when he passed. I had poured everything into this land, turning it into a thriving homestead where fireflies danced at dusk and the rooster's crow greeted each morning. I was here first. That was the important part. My farm existed long before Oak Ridge Estates and its parade of uniform, oversized houses sprang up 3 years ago. For a while, things were fine. The people who moved in were different from me, more suited to country clubs than country roads, but we got along well enough. Then Karen Whitfield arrived. I should have known the first time she marched to the property line, crisp white pants untouched by the dirt beneath her polished designer flats. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't say hello. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward my rooster and snapped, "Is that thing going to crow at 5 in the morning every morning?" I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to be neighborly. "That's Harold," I said with a smile. "And yeah, he's just doing his job. Farm animals make noise sometimes. That's country living." Karen pursed her lips like she'd just sucked on a lemon. "This isn't the country anymore. This is Oak Ridge Estates. And we have standards." I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another city dweller struggling to adjust. But I should have paid attention to the way she eyed my land like it was something to be fixed. The letters started arriving the next week. Stiff, official-looking papers from the HOA listing violations I wasn't even subject to: too many chickens, unsightly garden tools, improper fencing. At first, I laughed. I wasn't part of their HOA. My land was independent. Their rules had nothing to do with me. But the letters kept coming. And the way my neighbors looked at me started to change. Emily Carter, one of the few friendly faces left, pulled me aside one evening as she walked her dog past my property. "Karen's been showing pictures of your farm at HOA meetings," she said, glancing around as if afraid someone might hear. "She's saying it's a health hazard. Some people believe her. Can she really do anything?" I asked. Emily hesitated. Her husband is friends with someone on the county zoning board. She's been talking about getting the property lines redrawn. That night, I didn't sleep. And I should have trusted my instincts, because Karen wasn't just trying to make my life difficult. She was laying the groundwork for something much worse. I knew something was wrong the second I turned onto my road. The sky had a strange, hazy tint, like a storm had rolled through, but there was no rain, just a thick, acrid smell hanging in the air. It smelled like fire. My stomach twisted as I pressed the gas pedal harder, my old truck groaning in protest. The closer I got to home, the stronger the stench became. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes, seeps into your skin. The kind that doesn't just come from a small burn pile or an accident. The kind that means something is gone. Then I saw it. I slammed on the brakes so hard my truck skidded sideways, kicking up a cloud of dust over the lifeless remains of my farm. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My beautiful vegetable garden, where I had planted every seed by hand, was nothing but blackened dirt. My chicken coop, the one I had built from scratch, reduced to a pile of charred wood and twisted wire. The small red barn where I stored my tools, my feed, everything I needed to keep my farm running, now a skeletal frame, still smoking from the fire that had swallowed it whole. I stumbled out of my truck, barely able to breathe as I ran toward the wreckage. "Ruby! Henrietta!" I called, my voice cracking as I desperately searched for any sign of my chickens. Silence. Not a single cluck. Not a single flutter of feathers. Just ashes and the lingering scent of something that had been alive once but wasn't anymore. My knees hit the ground, my jeans pressing into the damp remains of what used to be my life. 5 years of sweat, of sunrises and hard-earned progress, gone. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made me lift my head. A sleek, white SUV, spotless as ever, rolled up my driveway, stopping just short of the burned-out remains of my barn. The door opened, and out stepped Karen Whitfield. Not a hair out of place. Not a speck of dirt on her pristine white pants. Standing beside her was Rick Thompson, the HOA president, holding a leather folder in one hand like this was just another day at the office. Karen let out a slow, satisfied sigh as she looked around, then turned to me with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "looks like the farm problem has been taken care of." I barely heard the words over the roar in my ears. I was still kneeling in the ashes of what used to be my home, my hands clenching into fists as the weight of her words sank in. She was proud of this. She was enjoying this. "What do you mean, taken care of?" My voice came out rough, strangled. I forced myself to stand, even as my legs felt like they might give out beneath me. "This is my property. My land. You had no right." Rick cleared his throat and took a step forward, flipping open his folder. "Actually, Mr. Parker, according to the newly revised zoning laws, your land is now officially part of Oak Ridge Estates. As such, it is subject to the HOA's guidelines and regulations. Since you failed to comply with multiple violation notices, the board was within its rights to take necessary corrective actions." I stared at him, barely able to process what I was hearing. Zoning laws? My voice was quieter now, disbelief creeping in. "That's not possible. I never received any notice about a rezoning." Karen's smirk widened, her eyes shining with something close to amusement. "Oh, you did. We sent 3 notices while you were away. You really should have been more responsible." My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. I was taking care of my sick mother. Karen shrugged, completely indifferent. "Not our problem." I took a step toward her, every muscle in my body shaking with anger. "You burned down my farm. My animals. You." Rick held up a hand like he was some kind of neutral party in all of this. The HOA simply hired a contractor to remove the violations. If things got out of hand, well, perhaps the dry conditions contributed to the spread. Dry conditions? I repeated, my voice shaking. "You think this was an accident?" My gaze darted past them, scanning the faces of the Oak Ridge residents who had begun to gather at the edge of my property, whispering among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting their feet, unable to meet my eyes. Others, the ones who had once been friendly before Karen got to them, nodded in agreement. I turned back to Karen, who was now inspecting her nails, completely unfazed by the destruction around her. That's when I saw it. A glint of metal, just past the wreckage of my garden. My property marker. Still standing. Something wasn't adding up. I exhaled slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I think you should leave now," I said quietly, my voice so steady it almost surprised me. Karen let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Or what? You'll sick your chickens on us?" "Oh, wait, you can't." Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward until I was close enough to see the tiny flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "You've made a huge mistake, Karen. And you're going to regret it." The smirk wavered. Just for a second. Then Rick put a hand on her arm and guided her back toward the SUV. "We'll give you some time to process this," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You have 30 days to bring the rest of your property into compliance with HOA standards. The rule book is in your mailbox." The SUV door shut with a quiet click. The engine purred to life. And just like that, they were gone, leaving behind nothing but a smoldering wasteland where my farm had stood. I turned back to the property marker, sunlight glinting off the metal. The words Parker Property Line were still etched into it, clear as day. Karen had made one fatal mistake. She forgot to check the boundaries. And I was about to make sure she paid for it. The smell of smoke still clung to my clothes as I sat in my living room, surrounded by papers. My hands shook as I flipped through zoning records, county maps, anything I could get my hands on that might prove what I already suspected. Karen and the HOA had no legal right to touch my farm. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. All I could think about was the way Karen had stood there, smiling, as she surveyed the wreckage of my life. I grabbed another stack of documents, scanning each line with tired, burning eyes. And then, on page 43 of the county's rezoning records, I saw it. A single line buried deep in the fine print. My land was partially rezoned, but the boundary line, the one Karen so confidently claimed included my farm, ended at Willow Creek. Everything east of the creek, including my barn, my garden, my chicken coop, all of it, had never been subject to HOA control. I froze, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. They hadn't just overstepped. They hadn't just misinterpreted a rule. They had destroyed property they had no jurisdiction over. And that meant every fine, every notice, every so-called legal action they had taken against me was built on a lie. I needed proof. I drove straight to the county recorder's office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked inside, my voice was sharp with urgency as I spoke to the woman behind the counter. "I need confirmation about the rezoning of County Road 16, specifically regarding the boundary at Willow Creek." The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, typed into her computer. "Let me pull that up for you," she said. A few seconds passed before she frowned at the screen. "That's odd. The official rezoning clearly states the creek is the limit of HOA jurisdiction." My heart pounded as I leaned closer. "Can you print that for me?" She nodded. Within minutes, I held the county maps in my hands, clear, indisputable proof that the HOA had no legal right to touch my farm. I didn't waste a second. I drove straight to the sheriff's office. By the time I walked through the doors, I was shaking, not with fear, but with rage. "I need to report illegal destruction of property," I told the deputy at the front desk, slamming the documents down in front of him. His eyebrows lifted as he skimmed the papers. "Ma'am, this is serious," he muttered, already calling another officer over. Within minutes, I was sitting across from Sheriff Bill Davis himself, explaining everything: the fire, the rezoning scam, Karen's smug confession. He listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "I'll be honest, Jake," he said, tapping a finger on the map. "This isn't just a civil dispute. If what you're saying is true, the HOA is in serious trouble. We're gonna need to open a formal investigation." That was all I needed to hear. By the time I left, the sheriff had already dispatched a team to examine the burn site. But I wasn't done yet. Karen and Rick thought they could get away with this. They thought I would just take it and walk away. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. That evening, I walked into the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center, where the HOA was holding its monthly meeting. The room was filled with homeowners, most of whom had turned their backs on me the moment Karen started spreading lies about my farm. Karen sat at the front, flanked by Rick and the other board members, looking as polished and smug as ever. "This is a private meeting," she snapped the moment she saw me. I smiled coldly. Actually, as a property owner affected by HOA decisions, I have the right to attend. Rick cleared his throat. We hear from non-members at the end of the meeting. What I have to say can't wait. I stepped forward, pulling out my documents. Did you all know that your HOA burned down my farm illegally and that you might be personally liable for the damages? The room went silent. Karen's expression didn't waver, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear. That's not true, she said, her voice sharp. Your property was rezoned months ago. Only partially. I unfolded the county maps and placed them on an empty chair in the front row, where everyone could see. The official zoning excludes the eastern portion of my property, where the creek forms a natural boundary. Everything the HOA destroyed, my barn, my garden, my livestock, was never under your control. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few homeowners leaned in, their faces paling as they examined the maps. Rick's face drained of color. We followed the zoning maps provided to us, he stammered. I pulled out another paper, the hand-drawn map with Karen's signature on it. You mean this map? The one you created without official approval? The murmurs grew louder. Lisa Carter, one of the few homeowners who had always been kind to me, stood up. Rick, did you actually verify the boundaries before approving this? Of course he did, Karen snapped, her bracelets jingling as she crossed her arms. That farm was disgusting. Chickens making noise at all hours, that horrible compost pile. Property values don't override the law, I interrupted. My voice was steady, but my hands clenched at my sides. And speaking of the law, I filed a police report today. Karen's head snapped toward me. You can't prove we did anything. I pulled out my phone. On the screen, a grainy security camera video played, capturing a truck with Oak Ridge Estates HOA on the side, pulling onto my property just days before I returned home. A timestamp in the corner showed the exact time and date. The room erupted into chaos. That's illegal, someone shouted. We never agreed to this, another voice rang out. Lisa turned to Rick, her face tight with fury. I motioned to immediately suspend any board members involved in this decision pending investigation. Second, another homeowner said instantly. Karen's face went ghost white. You can't do this, she shrieked, but the voices of the community drowned her out. Rick raised a trembling hand. Perhaps we should. Too late, I cut in, my voice low. Because my attorney is contacting yours first thing tomorrow morning. And she specializes in property disputes and HOA overreach. I gathered my documents, stepping away as the meeting descended into chaos. Karen and Rick's voices were lost beneath the shouting, the arguing. Homeowners who once ignored me were turning on them, demanding answers. I walked out of the community center into the crisp night air, inhaling deeply. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time since I had found my farm in ashes, I felt hope. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. I barely had time to rub the sleep from my eyes before I saw the caller ID, Sheriff Bill Davis. My heart pounded as I answered. Mr. Parker, he said, his tone clipped and serious. We got the preliminary fire inspector's report back. You're going to want to hear this. I sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. Go on. The fire wasn't caused by dry conditions, he said. It was accelerated. We found traces of gasoline in multiple locations across your property, specifically near your barn, the chicken coop, and the compost area. I swallowed hard. So it wasn't just carelessness? There was a pause before Davis replied. No, Jake. It was arson. A cold weight settled in my chest. I had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a slow, simmering rage through me. Someone had deliberately set my farm on fire. Someone had poured gasoline on my land, my home, my animals, and lit the match. And I already knew who my number one suspect was. As soon as I hung up, I grabbed my truck keys and drove straight to Emily Carter's house. She had been one of the few neighbors who didn't turn on me, and if anyone had their ear to the ground, it was her. She opened the door before I could even knock, her face pale. "Jake," she breathed, glancing nervously over her shoulder before stepping aside to let me in. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Emily, I need to know what people are saying. Did Karen or anyone on the HOA mention anything about the fire before I came back?" She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Not exactly, but, the morning after the fire, I overheard Rick and Karen arguing outside her house. I was walking my dog, and they were shouting at each other. Rick kept saying, 'This wasn't the plan, Karen.' And she told him to shut up before anyone heard." I clenched my fists. "And you didn't think to tell me this sooner?" She flinched but held her ground. I didn't know what to do. "You don't know how these HOA people work, Jake. They have money, connections, people are scared of them." She lowered her voice. "But I did something else. I looked through my security camera footage. I have a camera facing the street near Karen's house. I felt my pulse quicken. And?" Emily bit her lip, then grabbed her phone from the coffee table, tapping on the screen before turning it toward me. The video was grainy but clear enough. A white SUV. Karen's SUV. Parked near my property line the morning of the fire. And then, Karen stepping out, carrying something in her hands. I squinted at the screen. "Is that a gas can?" Emily finished, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize what it meant at the time, but after hearing what the sheriff found, I didn't hear the rest. I was already out the door. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, storming inside with Emily right behind me. "I have something you need to see," I told Davis the second I spotted him. He took one look at the video and called in 2 deputies. "We're getting a warrant," he said. "Now." By the afternoon, police were swarming Karen's house. I stood across the street, watching as she emerged from her front door, arms crossed, her face a mix of annoyance and barely concealed panic. She exchanged heated words with Davis before disappearing inside with 2 officers. Minutes later, they emerged with evidence bags, including what looked like an empty gas can from her garage. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. Karen was led out of the house, her wrists locked in handcuffs. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small measure of justice. But it wasn't over. Not yet. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and zoning maps, my phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway. "Mr. Parker?" a man's voice asked. "Yes. This is David Wallace. I live 3 houses down from Karen." He paused. "I have security cameras facing her backyard. You might want to come see something." I was in my truck before he could say another word. Wallace greeted me at his front door, looking grim. He led me inside, where his laptop screen showed another security footage clip, this one from the night before Karen's arrest. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. The video showed Karen sneaking onto my burned-out property. And she wasn't empty-handed. She was carrying a bottle of lighter fluid, Wallace said. "She placed it near what's left of your barn and left in a hurry." My blood ran cold. Even after everything, even with a criminal investigation closing in on her, Karen had come back. And she had tried to set another fire. I didn't hesitate. I forwarded the footage to Davis. By morning, Karen was facing additional charges. But the biggest bombshell came later that afternoon. Rick Thompson showed up at my door, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. He wasn't wearing his usual smug expression. If anything, he looked scared. "We need to talk," he said. I folded my arms. "I don't have anything to say to you." "You will," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. "Look, I screwed up. I trusted Karen. She told me this whole thing was about community standards, but I found something you need to see." He shoved a thick folder into my hands. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside were documents from a real estate development company. A company Karen was secretly a silent partner in. Plans for luxury homes. Blueprints showing new construction over what used to be my farm. "This wasn't about the HOA," Rick muttered, rubbing his face. "It was never about property values. Karen wanted your land gone because she was planning to develop it. She didn't care how it happened." My hands tightened around the papers. Karen had been trying to steal my land from the start. And now, she was going to lose everything. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the verdict. Karen Whitfield, once the self-proclaimed queen of Oak Ridge Estates, now sat stiff-backed, her hands clenched in her lap as the words "guilty on all counts" echoed through the room. Arson. Fraud. Criminal trespass. Destruction of property. Her real estate development scheme had crumbled beneath the weight of her own arrogance, and the jury had taken less than 2 hours to decide her fate. When she finally turned to look at me, there was no more smugness, no more condescension, only cold, simmering hatred. But I didn't care. She had tried to destroy me. Instead, she had destroyed herself. Her conviction all but sealed my civil case against the HOA. The settlement they offered wasn't just enough to rebuild, it was enough to make damn sure they would never interfere with my land again. I had my lawyer put it in writing: no future rezoning, no future harassment, no HOA control, ever. I watched the board members sign the agreement with tight jaws and pale faces. Their once powerful HOA was in shambles, half the members had resigned, and residents were furious at the massive fines they would now have to pay. Rick Thompson, no longer president, avoided my eyes as he added his name to the paperwork. Rebuilding took months, but this time, I wasn't alone. Neighbors, even ones who had ignored me before, showed up to help. The people who had once crossed the street to avoid my farm were now planting vegetables with me, rebuilding my barn, fixing my chicken coop. Lisa Carter even helped organize a community farmers market, hosted right in Oak Ridge Estates. And Karen? She sold her house at a massive loss and disappeared. The young family that moved in loves fresh eggs. Their kids helped me collect them on Saturday mornings. A year after the fire, I stood on my porch, watching the sunrise over my farm, stronger than ever. The land had healed, the crops were thriving, and my chickens, a new flock, were happier than ever. I had won. Not just in court, but in proving that no amount of greed, no HOA rules, no entitled Karen could take away what was rightfully mine. And as I sipped my coffee, the thought crossed my mind: how many others had been bullied, threatened, and harassed by HOAs who thought they could rewrite the rules. Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.